Hello. Today we're going to briefly introduce the topic of evolution. And by evolution, we are talking about what changes populations over time. And you know from your reading that you were reading about Charles Darwin and his trip to the Galapagos Islands and some of the observations he made. And we're actually going to go into what is the theory of natural selection so that we understand it. A lot of people, there's certainly a lot of discussion and perhaps even some controversy surrounding evolution and what's actually being said there. And really, we need to start with what was said historically before we can even talk about how that has evolved, if you'll pardon the pun, and how that's changed over time. So if you'll follow through with me on these slides, we'll proceed forward from there. This is a tortoise hatching, and so it reminds me of the tortoises on the Galapagos Islands and gives us a little something to think about with regard to Darwin. See, Darwin didn't operate in a vacuum. I mean, you can see here from this timeline, and don't sweat it. We're not going to have to memorize everything on the timeline here, but you can see that there were different groups here, the non-Darwinians and then Darwinians who followed after his theory, right? And then the neo-Darwinians, the folks these days, right? And you can see the timeline proceeds through here from early to late. But Darwin built on some of the discussion that came before him, Malthus, right? And certainly in response to some of the thoughts of Lamarck. And you would think, because they happened much about the same time, that Gregor Mendel, but not until later in his life and in his writing did he respond to Mendel. But people had long been asking these ontological questions, these questions about where did life come from, how did it become the way it is today, and how has it changed over time. So we start out here with this slide about natural selection, and Darwin made three observations. And you'll remember that the difference between an observation and an inference is an observation is just an objective, this is what happened kind of a statement, but an inference is an attempt to explain why that might be. So in science, it's very important to separate observations and inferences. The first observation that Darwin made is that all populations have the potential for exponential growth. Consider rabbits for a moment. Rabbits, if left to their own devices, would mate and increase their population size, and you would think there would be no stop to it, right? And the next generation of rabbits would have more rabbits and so on until we were overrun by legomorphs. But observation 2 says this actually doesn't happen. Populations tend to remain stable in size. Observation 3, environmental resources are limited. So with consideration of rabbits, they don't have an unlimited and inexhaustible food supply. There's not miles and miles of space in which you could have rabbit populations. All right, so the observations then bring us on to inference number 1. These three observations lead to inference number 1, and that inference is that overproduction leads to a struggle for existence that only some survive. In other words, populations Darwin said, attempt to grow exponentially, but because environmental resources are limited, observation 3, then overproduction leads to a struggle for existence that only some survive, inference 1, and then observation 2, populations tend to remain stable. So he goes on, he made a couple more observations. Observation number 4, variation exists within populations. When we consider rabbits again, not all rabbits are the same. Some are larger, some are smaller, taller, shorter, darker, lighter colored. Some are more resistant to certain diseases, and some are more prone to get those diseases. Fatter and skinnier, and so on. And we know that much of this variation is heritable. And at the time, of course, he didn't know about genes and gene theory. That was to come much later. But he knew about heredity. And so Darwin reasoned that this variation came from the parents and the parents of those parents and so on, and that's how it was passed on to the offspring. Natural selection, 2 more inferences. The inference number 2, that survival of the fittest occurs according to who has the best genes to meet the environmental conditions of the time. right? Not like Lamarck was saying. Lamarck said that those organisms who adapted or tried to be more fit to the environment, we now know that organisms can't change themselves to become something that they are not. However, those who are gifted, as it were, with what's needed for the moment, whether that be dark fur in a forest that helps them to camouflage themselves in their environment versus the light-furred cousin that they have that ends up looking more conspicuous and being eaten first by the predator, or what have you. In your book, there's an example with the moths that you can refer to for that. Then inference number 3, inequity of organism survival changes the population over generations. In other words, sometimes conditions favor one kind of rabbit and sometimes conditions favor another. But whatever the conditions are, they are the natural selective agent that selects for who will survive to live on and mate and pass their genes on to their offspring. So this has been a quick introduction to the idea of natural selection. You remember that it's made up of 5 observations and 3 inferences. Those are important to know for this class.